Hey, so there's been something kind of floating around on like X and Blue Sky that I saw. That's something that Miyamoto has supposedly said, and it's kind of got plenty of people kind of a little bit irked. And admittedly, it wound me a little bit up as well too when I first read it. But I've been digging into it, and I think it might just be a little bit of a victim of like mistranslation and possibly just kind of taken out of context a little bit. In terms of what it was, let me just kind of jump over to the browser here. There was a tweet here from Stealth, and I've seen other people reporting on it as well, not just to single him out. But it says here that Miyamoto has spoken with Kyoto News about why Nintendo has made a serious push into making movies. And the kind of quote here is that games eventually stop running when newer versions of things come out, but films remain forever. Now, I can see why some people might kind of see that quote in isolation and get a little bit peeved because, games don't stop running, do they? I mean, when newer versions come out, I can still today play Super Mario Brothers 40 years on from when it first launched and still play it right now. I've got my Nintendo Switch and I can play it no problem. And there's countless other ways to play that game, as I'm sure we all know. And obviously there's emulators as well, which of course Nintendo don't want to talk about, and they've got the whole kind of relationship with that and that kind of awkward side of it in terms of the accessibility of their products. But there's also nothing stopping you hooking up a Nintendo Entertainment System and playing those old games as well. So it's not a case of the fact that films remain forever, because even that as a point isn't technically true, is it? I mean, there are plenty of films that I wanted to watch that I can't watch. They're not on streaming. They've never had a DVD release, for example, or torrents of them. The accessibility isn't a kind of guaranteed thing, even with films. So this kind of would-be quote here from Miyamoto that has been picked up countless times. I've seen today people kind of talking about it, and obviously even in the replies here, talking about emulation and stuff. But Twitter's a hellhole, so let's not concentrate too much on that. But yeah, I can see why, kind of taken out of context, this might be kind of misunderstood. So I wanted to kind of look into it a little bit more and kind of dig into why this might be, has he said this? It didn't seem right to me. Anyway, so this post from Stealth mentions that Miyamoto spoke with Kyoto News. Now, this article in reference from Kyoto News is specifically talking about Nintendo and Capcom getting into doing more kind of movies, which is true. Obviously Nintendo have done both, like the first Mario movie, they got the second one on the way, and they've got a Zelda movie coming too. So that's accurate. In terms of the actual story itself here, it says major Japanese developers, Nintendo and Capcom, are stepping up their efforts to bring iconic characters to the big screen. Mario, Zelda, like we just said. In August, the company reorganized a subsidiary, Nintendo Pictures, to kind of focus on this. Yes, yes, yes. Working with Illumination, that's all true too. And then it says Miyamoto, and then there's a quote from him. It says, games eventually stop running when newer versions come out, but films remain forever, he said. And that is exactly what Stealth has taken here and shared more widely. Now, then it goes on to talk about Capcom. So that's the end of the article. In terms of like the conversation with Miyamoto, it's just one line. So when Stealth here said that they spoke with Kyoto News, I don't believe Miyamoto did speak with Kyoto News. I think this is a quote taken from elsewhere and just kind of punched into this article to kind of add a little bit of flavor maybe, or some context, but I don't think it's correct. So in terms of like where this quote has come from, because there's no quote here saying that Kyoto News has spoken directly to Miyamoto, I don't believe that is the case, and there's no further words from him either, so it's just one line. So I did a bit of digging, and I think it possibly came from this Nintendo Dream article here, where Miyamoto is specifically talking about the Nintendo Museum and kind of how people access their IP in that kind of space and in that sort of context. So looking into this, and then I kind of did a rough translation of it, and it's not perfect, but in terms of what this article says, Miyamoto is specifically talking about the museum, and there's like a character themed exhibition, and like, the question from this kind of Q&A bit is specifically talking about Nintendo IP and kind of the expansion of Nintendo's IP, which has been a big focus for the company in the past several years. You've probably heard it in kind of their shareholder meetings a lot, like Furukawa talking about expansion of access to their IPs outside of games, and that is kind of part of this kind of conversation that Nintendo are having over the past kind of several years or so in terms of like their theme parks, their movies, and so on. So the question is kind of like, what Nintendo's kind of position would be in terms of expanding their IP in the future. And the kind of line that I think the Kyoto News article is kind of pulling from, where it says games eventually stop running when newer versions come out, but films remain forever, I believe is this section just here. I don't know if I can bump that up so you can see it a bit better. I made it worse, haven't I? Yeah, here we go. So, like Miyamoto is saying here, so after all, what everyone remembers is IP. True, that is true. If the game changes to a new version, it won't work. Questionable kind of phrasing, maybe, but I don't agree with it entirely. But I understand what he's saying. If you haven't got your old Nintendo anymore, then yes, having access to that game like that isn't as straightforward as it could be. Sure. And then it says, "This is very lonely." I think that is a poor translation. So I actually did another translation of this here. So it says here, what people remember after all is the IP. Games become obsolete when new versions come out. Questionable, but that's incredibly sad. Okay, so he's talking about access to games being a sad thing in terms of how it's not always so straightforward, right? And then we started creating films partly because of this sadness, not wholly because of it, partly because of it, and the sadness that the things that could only be played on virtual console. Okay, firstly, it's hilarious that Miyamoto is talking about the virtual console in the year 2024, 2025, whenever this was from. We haven't had a virtual console since like 2016 or something like that. So that's just amusing in and of itself. But he said even making them playable in a museum has its limits, but films can remain forever. So he did say the whole kind of thing about films remaining forever. Fair enough. But we have to remember this article is about Nintendo's museum. And the context in which that's being said is around the kind of broader access to their IP and how you can demonstrate that IP within a museum context. Okay. So Miyamoto is saying that, yeah, in a museum, people can come in and kind of get hands on with stuff and kind of get a sense of it. But when they can go home and watch a movie, the kind of characters endure, right? Without kind of having to be like an active participant is what I think would be a generous read of what he's trying to say here. So it's digging around kind of a bit more kind of around this, and like, he's not really saying that, oh yeah, things are hard to play. And I just think it's a bit of a mistranslation. And these things can be easily taken out of context when you just kind of get a kind of slim snippet of it, which is what this is. I think the Kyoto News article has picked something up from this broader article about the museum and kind of put it in a context of talking about their movies. And it's been taken kind of as gospel of Miyamoto kind of basically shunning the preservation efforts of kind of the wider industry at large. I don't know. I mean, I'm not entirely sure on this, but that's kind of my read on it anyway. I think it's very easy for these kind of quotes to be kind of misinterpreted or kind of shared without the context of the kind of framing of what they've been saying about. And from my understanding, at least, this was a interview about Nintendo and Miyamoto talking about the museum specifically and how people can access those IPs kind of. So say you go to this museum, you get a little bit of a hands-on time with the game, and then you can go home and watch the movie and kind of get a fleshed out kind of understanding of what the Mario universe is about without having to play the games, if that makes sense. So I don't think he's kind of outright saying that games stop running when new versions come out. It's more about the kind of ease of access, and that's a whole other story. I admit the whole kind of emulation story and the access and preservation thing is a separate thing. I don't really think that's what he's getting at here. I think it's probably more about the kind of digestibility of how you can kind of access games versus access films. There's problems with both, but yeah, I think one is easier than the other. It might be a charitable read on it, I don't know, but in terms of what I think he meant and what's been said, I think there's probably a little bit of a miscommunication here in terms of the vision of what he was trying to get across, if that makes sense. I don't want to read into this too much, but yeah, there was another link actually I spotted on Blue Sky, where people were kind of talking about this and trying to like debunk it a little bit. He's calling it legitimate raid bait, but yeah, the context was specifically about Nintendo's IP and the museum where they can see and use old hardware. Here's another kind of translation actually. Ultimately, where people remember the IPs, games become obsolete when the new versions come out, but that's incredibly sad. We started video production partly because of that sadness and seeing our creations become playable only on virtual console. So I do think it's largely talking about the kind of experience, the kind of experiential nature of playing a video game with that kind of hands-on tactile feel versus that of a movie, which is more of a kind of like you saying you just kind of consume, you don't really interact with, and it's that kind of difference that maybe is what he's trying to touch upon here. The point was about the progression of time and IPs. He mentions a virtual console. Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I just thought it was worth highlighting because this quote is going all over the shop in kind of the Nintendo circles, and I don't know if it's quite right. And I'm not outright saying it is right or wrong. I just think it was kind of worth highlighting maybe in terms of the broader picture of where this quote came from. It wasn't an article I don't think that Kyoto News spoke directly to Miyamoto. I think it has been pulled from this Nintendo Dream article, which I will put a link for in the description down below if you want to go and take a look at it. But yeah, just thought I'd give a little bit of nuance to the conversation here, a bit of messy nuance. I agree. I'm a bit all over this in terms of like my thoughts on it as well. But just in terms of just thinking a bit more kind of critically about where things have come from and how the context in which they were said, basically, before sharing them. Because these things can kind of get taken out of context sometimes, and I understand how that happens. I mean, there are times when we're all kind of keen to share things and rush to kind of share things without kind of going too deep on it. But yeah, that's kind of it. I just wanted to share. That's kind of my thoughts on it. And I don't think it is him kind of dunking on games, but I can see totally why it could be taken out of context of him kind of dunking on it. But yeah, there are things Nintendo could be doing in terms of preservation and accessibility to their old library of games. And don't want to come across some sort of Nintendo apologist here, because yeah, there are absolutely stuff they could be doing to help preservation. But I don't think that's what this is about. I'm going to leave it at that. So yeah, thanks for watching. If you liked me ranting at you for however long it's been, 10 minutes, then like and subscribe. Cheers.